Sean Taylor had never believed in fate. He built his life on precision and control, both in the houses he restored and in the relationships he slowly walked away from. After 30 years in the contracting business, he knew what it meant to tear things down and build them back up, piece by stubborn piece. He wasn't sentimental, not even about homes, which most people claimed carried a soul. To him, walls were walls, beams were beams, and a front porch was just wood and nails meant to hold your weight. Nothing more. That mindset served him well. It made him successful, respected, and, eventually, tired. Tired enough to walk away from everything he had built in the city and retreat somewhere quiet, where no one expected him to answer his phone after dark, or justify why he wanted to replace an entire foundation just because it didn't sit right. He'd bought the house site unseen, a quiet one-story cottage with a wide-open yard and a wide-open porch in a town small enough that Google Street View hadn't bothered updating its photos since 2012. It wasn't the kind of place someone moved to for business or friends or even peace of mind. Sean had chosen it because of one thing: the view from the porch. It had been listed in the property photos, third image in, almost an afterthought. The camera pointed slightly too low, catching the faded railing, the cracked top step, and the edge of a chipped coffee mug that the previous owner had forgotten to move. Beyond that, trees. Not too many, not too few. Just enough to breathe. There was something about the frame of the photo that stuck with him. He'd zoomed in, noticed the irregular grain of the wood, the way the sunlight fell in patches over the floorboards, and thought, "This is mine?" He didn't even call the realtor. He just put in an offer, packed up his tools, and left everything else behind. The first morning after the move, Sean stood barefoot on that very porch, mug in hand, and took a long breath. It was early spring, the air still carrying a sharp edge, and the ground was damp from an overnight drizzle. Birds chirped in that lazy, spaced-out rhythm of small towns, and even though the neighborhood wasn't silent, it felt still. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking down the slope of his front yard toward the cracked sidewalk. Across the narrow street sat a row of houses, none too close, none too far. Everything was where it should be. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee and leaned against the railing, already planning which boards he'd replace first. The wood was old but honest. No shortcuts, no rot hidden behind paint. Just time and weather, and time he had plenty of. He was about to head back inside when he heard the voice. "You're standing on the wrong side of the line." He turned, expecting maybe a neighbor trying to make a strange first impression. What he saw instead was a woman. Maybe late 60s, maybe older. One of those faces where time hadn't softened the features, only sharpened them. She stood just outside her gate, 3 houses down, wearing a cardigan that looked too thick for the weather, holding a pair of garden shears like she'd come out to clip roses and accidentally wandered into a standoff. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't smiling either. Just staring. Sean blinked, unsure if she was talking to him. She nodded toward the porch under his feet. "That line right there. This isn't your side." He followed her gaze, squinting at the boards. Nothing marked. No border, no paint, not even a crack separating one half from another. Just a clean, flat surface. "I think you're mistaken," he said calmly, not moving. She shook her head once. "You're the second one to try this. The first didn't stay long either." And then, just as abruptly as she had appeared, she turned and walked back inside her house. Gate shut behind her with a sharp click. Sean stood frozen, coffee forgotten in his hand, still staring at the spot where she had stood. He wasn't the kind of man who rattled easily. Years on job sites had taught him to deal with drunks, frauds, scammers, and more than a few irate homeowners. But something about the way she spoke, as if she was stating a fact, not an opinion, bothered him. There had been no accusation in her voice, no anger. Just certainty. Back inside, he tried to shake it off. Every neighborhood had its strange ones. The woman, he'd later learn her name was Karen, probably had nothing better to do than make new people feel unwelcome. Maybe she was the unofficial historian of the block. The type who thought she had ownership over the entire street because her family had lived there longer than anyone else. It didn't matter. He didn't buy the house to make friends. He bought it to finally be left alone. Still, when he passed by her property on the way to the grocery store that afternoon, he couldn't help but glance at her yard. Neatly kept, not a weed in sight. A porch with potted plants arranged in symmetrical pairs. Curtains drawn tight. There was no sign of her. That night, he sat on his own porch again, tools spread out beside him, stripping the old paint from the railings. He worked quietly, radio off, the street empty. Every now and then he caught himself glancing toward her house. No movement. No light in the window. Nothing. The next morning, something changed. He opened his door and stepped outside, only to stop short. A wooden stake had been driven into the corner of his lawn where the porch steps met the grass. A plastic flag fluttered from the top, bright red with the words, "Private Area, Entry Restricted," printed in bold black letters. There was no note, no explanation, just the flag and the stake perfectly centered. He looked around, no one in sight. He walked down to it, touched it. The stake had been hammered deep. It wasn't coming out without effort. Sean didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, he took out his phone, snapped a photo, and went back inside. He wasn't about to lose his temper over a plastic flag, but something told him this wasn't the end of it. That same afternoon, as he backed his truck out of the driveway, he noticed a piece of folded paper stuck under the windshield wiper. Unfolding it, he found a blurry photocopy of what looked like a black and white survey map. No address, no signature, just plot lines and a handwritten note across the top. Porch line exceeded original boundary. Correct before enforcement. He sat in the truck for a long time, just staring at the paper. The porch had been built over 40 years ago. He'd confirmed that before the purchase. There was no mention of disputes, no easements, no variances filed. Yet here it was, a warning, vague and self-issued. And that word, enforcement. Sean wasn't new to conflict, but this wasn't a negotiation. It didn't feel like someone trying to push boundaries. It felt like someone trying to reassert control over something they believed was already theirs. And for the first time in a very long time, Sean felt it. The itch. The old pressure behind the ribs. That tension in his shoulders that told him he wasn't in just any neighborhood. He was standing on a porch that someone else still believed they owned, and that someone was watching, waiting, and willing to escalate. And whether he liked it or not, the only way out was through. The stake with the red flag remained in the ground for 2 full days. Sean left it alone on purpose. He wanted to see what would happen if he didn't respond, if he simply ignored it and carried on with his life as if it hadn't been placed there like a challenge. But nothing in the neighborhood moved without being noticed. Each morning he saw curtains twitching as he stepped onto his porch. Not just Karen's, but from other homes too. People watching, waiting. No one approached him, no one waved or offered small talk. It was as if some unspoken memo had gone out that he was already on probation, that he'd somehow failed a test he never agreed to take. On the 3rd morning, the flag was gone. Not pulled or knocked over. Gone completely, stake and all. In its place was a small stone, flat and oval, with faded red paint still visible on one side. It wasn't shaped like a marker or a tool, more like something picked up from a riverbed and placed there with quiet, deliberate intent. Sean bent down, picked it up, and turned it over. The other side was smooth, but scratched across its surface was a single word. Return. That was the moment Sean realized this wasn't about boundaries in the legal sense. This wasn't someone worried about fence lines or survey reports. This was about possession, territory, ritual even. It disturbed him, not because it was hostile, he could handle hostility, but because it was methodical. There was patience in it, strategy. Karen wasn't just acting out of impulse or paranoia. She was building a case, not for court, but for herself, to justify what was coming next. And what came next was small, almost petty, but unmistakably calculated. Sean's mail stopped arriving. 3 days in a row, his box was empty. At first, he assumed it was a delay. Weather, maybe. Then he saw the mail carrier drive right past his house without slowing. He flagged them down on the 4th day, stepping into the street. "You skipped me," Sean said, keeping his voice level. The carrier looked up from her clipboard, confused. "Sorry, what's the address?" He gave it. She frowned, checked her list, then looked back at him. "It's on hold." Sean blinked. "What do you mean on hold?" "There was a request to suspend delivery. Temporary hold, 10 days. Said homeowner requested it." "I didn't request anything." She hesitated. "Well, I can't confirm who submitted it, but it was done online. You'll have to go to the post office to sort it." When he did, the clerk behind the counter printed out a copy of the request. There was no signature, just an electronic submission timestamp and a partially redacted email address. Not enough to prove identity, but enough to show intent. Someone had impersonated him, filed the request, and paused his life with a few keystrokes. It wasn't damaging, not yet, but it was invasive. Someone had reached inside his day-to-day routine and turned a dial. Sean filed a complaint. He asked to have his deliveries resumed, secured his mailbox with a lock, and for the first time, seriously considered installing a camera that faced the street instead of just the porch. But he couldn't shake the thought that everything happening was meant to feel light. Annoying, inconvenient, but not alarming. Like paper cuts delivered one at a time, never deep enough to bleed, but always somewhere tender. The next step in Karen's progression arrived not with mail or markings, but with presence. She began appearing at the edges of his vision, always at the periphery. He'd be working in the garage, and he'd catch a glimpse of her standing across the street, arms crossed, not hiding, but not moving. She never waved. She never spoke. She'd stand for a while, then disappear. Once he saw her at the hardware store standing in the same aisle he had just entered, looking down at a display of gutter guards with a blank expression. She left without buying anything. Another time, as he returned from the grocery store, he found a bag of mulch neatly stacked by his steps. He hadn't ordered any. No receipt. No brand he recognized. Just mulch, placed carefully, almost thoughtfully. He left it there for hours before finally moving it to the backyard, unsure if accepting it was giving in or claiming it. The turning point came when Sean received an envelope. Not in the mail, but tucked under his front doormat. It was unmarked. Just a plain manila envelope sealed with a strip of packing tape. Inside were 3 photographs, grainy but recent, all taken from the same angle, across the street, through what had to be binoculars or a long lens. Each photo showed him standing on the porch, in nearly identical poses, taken on different days. No notes, no threats, just images. Proof that he was being watched, not just by Karen, but possibly by others. The message was clear. He was being documented. Not for safety, but for narrative. He brought the photos to the local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty listened patiently, looked over the envelope, and filed a report. But when Sean mentioned Karen by name, the deputy's posture shifted slightly. Not defensive, more like resigned. "She's had some incidents," the deputy admitted, tapping the corner of the envelope. "Nothing violent, nothing chargeable, but she's persistent." "Has she done this before?" Sean asked. The deputy didn't answer directly. "Best thing you can do is keep track. Write everything down. Keep your cameras running. If anything crosses the line, let us know. Until then, there's not much we can do." Sean left feeling more exposed than ever. It wasn't just that Karen had done this to others. It was that the system around her had adjusted to her, like a body learning to live with a parasite rather than expelling it. That night, he made copies of the photos and stored them in a fireproof box with his documents. He replaced all the batteries in his security cameras. He checked the locks on every window. And then, for the first time since moving in, he brought his coffee mug inside with him when he finished on the porch. The final straw came on a Thursday morning. As he stepped outside, the air still thick with overnight humidity, he noticed something drawn on the lowest step of his porch. Not painted, scratched, carved even. It was a symbol, circular, with jagged lines radiating from the center like a sun or an eye. It hadn't been there the night before. The cut marks were fresh, shallow, but deliberate. Not random, not vandalism, a signature. Sean stared at it for a long time before reaching for his phone. He took several pictures, then called the sheriff again. This time, they sent someone out, a different deputy. She looked young, fresh out of training, trying to be authoritative but visibly uneasy. She examined the symbol, took her own photos, and made notes in her pad. "I'll file this under property tampering," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Will it be investigated?" She hesitated. We'll log it. If it escalates, you'll have a record. It wasn't enough, Sean knew that, but it was all he had for now. When the deputy left, he stood at the edge of the porch and stared out toward Karen's house. She was sitting in a chair on her own porch, perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching him. When their eyes met, she didn't flinch, didn't look away. She just smiled, barely. A twitch of the lips, not warm, not amused. A smile that said, "We both know what this is now." Sean turned and went back inside. For the rest of the day, he didn't step out once. He had bought the house to rebuild his peace, to claim a quiet life he had long put off. But now, every nail he drove, every piece of wood he replaced felt like an act of defiance. The porch was no longer a place of rest. It was a line in the sand, and the woman across the street had just made it clear. She wasn't done testing whether he'd hold it. By the end of the week, Sean no longer treated the porch as part of the house. It had become something separate, like a contested zone on a map. He still used it in the mornings out of sheer defiance, but the ease was gone. He no longer leaned on the railing with his mug and surveyed the trees. He stood now. He stayed alert. His posture had shifted, his movements sharper, his eyes more calculating. He no longer felt like a man who lived in that house, but like someone stationed there. Guarding, watching, waiting. Karen, by contrast, had grown more casual, as if she had reclaimed some invisible victory. She no longer avoided eye contact. In fact, she seemed to enjoy the visual tension between them, frequently stepping outside while he was on the porch, sometimes with a watering can, sometimes with no purpose at all except to stand at the edge of her lawn with a neutral expression and that same twitch of a smile. Then came the note. Unlike the photos and the scratch symbol, this was direct. A plain envelope sealed, slid under his front door sometime between midnight and dawn. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in tight, even lines with deliberate strokes. The letter was not signed, but it didn't need to be. The language was unmistakably hers. The structure you now occupy is an extension. The extension was never formally approved, and your continued presence upon it constitutes trespass by implication. You may occupy the interior. The porch is not yours. It never was. Sean stared at the paper, reading the sentences again and again, not because he didn't understand them, but because he couldn't believe someone had written them with such conviction. This wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. It wasn't a legal document, nor an attempt to extort or demand action. It was a philosophical declaration of war. Karen had created her own rulebook, and in it, the porch belonged to her. Not legally, not spatially, but in some conceptual framework that she had constructed and was now enforcing like a private doctrine. The house had lines. To her, Sean had crossed them. And every day he stood on that porch, she saw it as an offense. Sean brought the letter to his lawyer, a man named McConnell he had hired after the symbol carving incident. McConnell was not the dramatic type. He handled things like property line disputes, minor contract enforcement, and the occasional estate battle. He read the note silently, tapped his pen on the desk, and finally looked up. "She's clever," McConnell said. "Not crazy, not entirely." "She's obsessed," Sean replied. "She's constructing a narrative that could, if ignored, gain traction with the right people. She's been here longer than you. If she tells the same story to enough neighbors and you don't counter it, they'll believe her by default. People like to anchor their sense of order to those who claim to remember how things used to be." "So what do I do?" "Document everything. Log every interaction. Install more cameras if you can. Keep the footage. Respond to nothing directly. And absolutely do not let her bait you into stepping off that porch. She's angling for a confrontation." Sean did exactly that. He installed 2 additional cameras. One high on the corner of the house facing the street, and one embedded just above the porch steps, low and angled. He began keeping a written journal. He time-stamped every delivery, every unusual noise, every moment Karen entered or left her property. It felt paranoid, obsessive even. But every page gave him a deeper sense of control, and control was the only thing keeping him from walking straight across the lawn and demanding she explain herself face to face. It wasn't long before Karen escalated again. This time it was sound. Every morning, precisely at 5:40 a.m., She would turn on a battery-powered AM radio and place it on her porch railing. The volume wasn't high, but it was enough. Static. No station. Just the low hiss and occasional digital whine of an untuned signal. Sean could hear it through his front window, and the moment he stepped onto his porch at 6 Guys, the volume would rise. No words, no music. Just a broken frequency. When he looked across the street, Karen would be there, sitting in a lawn chair with the radio beside her, hands folded in her lap. She never touched the dial, never moved. The sound would continue until exactly 6:45 when she'd get up, pick up the radio, and go back inside. The pattern repeated for 3 days. On the 4th, Sean brought his phone out and filmed it. He didn't say anything, just stood on his porch and recorded 10 full minutes of static playing from across the street, Karen in frame, motionless. When he showed the footage to McConnell, the lawyer nodded. She's laying groundwork. If anyone accuses her of harassment, she'll say it's just her routine, her radio, her porch, her property, that she happens to enjoy static in the morning. She's pushing, Sean muttered. Looking for a crack. She wants you angry, McConnell confirmed. Don't give her what she wants. But she nearly got it the following week. It was trash day. Sean had rolled out his bins as usual, left them at the edge of his driveway the night before. When he came out the next morning, they were gone. Not knocked over, not vandalized, gone. No trail, no lid left behind, just empty space. He canvassed the block, but they weren't on anyone's lawn. He checked the alley, nothing. He called the city sanitation office. They confirmed his pickup was scheduled for that morning. They had no record of any removal. When he checked his camera footage, the answer was chilling. At exactly 2:13 a.m., a figure in a hoodie, small build, calmly walked into frame and wheeled both bins away toward the alley. The footage didn't capture the face, but the gait, the rhythm of movement. It was Karen. The size matched, the time matched, and the location, just enough in shadow, ensured no law would confirm it without speculation. Sean showed the video to the deputy who'd handled the porch carving. She watched it 3 times, frowning. It's suspicious, she admitted, but without a clear ID, it's not actionable. Even with the context? She sighed. This is what I mean when I say she's practiced. She's smart about where the lines are and how to stay just barely inside them. Sean left with no charges filed and a warning to continue documenting. That phrase had become a constant. Everyone told him to document, as if the act of observation alone might eventually amount to justice. Then came the petition, printed on glossy paper, hand-delivered to 6 houses on the street. Sean never received a copy directly, but a neighbor quietly slipped one into his mailbox with a note. I'm not signing this. Just thought you should know. The petition claimed that Sean had altered the visual harmony of the block by making unauthorized structural changes to a shared sightline. It referenced his porch explicitly. It cited local aesthetic regulations that no longer even existed, repealed years ago. But it was persuasive, in tone and presentation. 3 signatures had already been added. That evening, Sean sat on his porch with the petition in hand, flipping it over in silence. Across the street, Karen sat on her own porch, the radio turned off for once. She wasn't looking at him. She was reading something, or pretending to. The street between them felt thinner than usual, like the houses had moved closer together. The air condensed. It struck him then that she wasn't trying to win a case. She was trying to rewrite a history, one where Sean had never come, one where the porch remained untouched, empty, hers by memory or right of recall. And in her mind, this wasn't escalation. This was restoration. Sean stood up, walked to the edge of his steps, and leaned down. He pressed his palm to the board where the symbol had once been scratched, now sanded away, repainted, sealed. The wood felt warm, solid. His. He looked up and for the first time raised his voice so she could hear him. You don't own this. She didn't react, didn't flinch. She turned the page of her book, slow and deliberate. Sean stepped back inside, locked the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. He pulled out the envelope with the letter, the photos, the petition. He placed them side by side, then opened his notebook and wrote the date in clean capital letters. He was done waiting. Whatever she planned next, he would be ready. Sean didn't expect the petition to matter, not in any real legal sense. But that wasn't the point anymore. He understood now that Karen's efforts weren't about filing lawsuits or winning disputes. They were about legitimacy in the eyes of the neighborhood, and legitimacy didn't need facts. It needed familiarity, longevity, repetition. She had all of those, and Sean had none. His presence was new, temporary in their eyes, even if he legally owned the deed and paid his taxes like everyone else. That sense of being not from here had clung to him since day one, and Karen had weaponized it with skill. But there was something she hadn't counted on. He wasn't the kind of man to break down or pack up just because someone started pushing. That wasn't in his nature, and the moment he realized she had no intention of stopping, he made a choice. He would stop reacting. He would stop waiting for her next move. And instead he would quietly, methodically expose her behavior for exactly what it was: coordinated, escalating, and deliberate. It began with conversations. Sean walked down to the corner lot where an older man named Ted had lived for 20 years. Ted wasn't warm, but he wasn't hostile either. And when Sean mentioned the petition, Ted's face tightened. "I didn't sign that," he said flatly, then added, "But I saw who brought it around. Her and her son." Sean blinked. "She has a son. Doesn't live here. Shows up when things get too heavy for her. Talks to people like he's lived here his whole life." He hasn't. That fact opened a door Sean hadn't looked behind. He started asking quietly, carefully. No confrontation, just questions. At the hardware store, at the gas station, at the diner where he'd begun picking up breakfast once a week. What he found was a mixture of sympathy and fatigue. Karen had a reputation, not for violence or public outbursts, but for control. She didn't yell, she maneuvered. She had opinions on where Christmas decorations should go, how loud a lawnmower should be, which trees should be trimmed and when. Most people had simply adapted. She was a fixture, like a storm drain that sometimes overflowed. You didn't rip it out, you worked around it. But quietly, a few people admitted they had been waiting for someone like Sean. Someone who didn't back down. One woman, Clara, who lived on the next block, told him over coffee that Karen once filed a noise complaint about her grandchildren playing in the sprinkler on a Sunday. She didn't want to hear laughter during her reading hour, Clara said with a dry smile. Didn't call the cops. She called the homeowners board. Sean nodded. It all lined up. No violence, just pressure. No accusations, just suggestions. Karen knew how to make her version of order seem preferable, even logical. With McConnell's help, Sean requested a boundary reaffirmation from the county. It wasn't a new survey. It was a formal reiteration of the existing records, notarized and certified. It wouldn't change anything physically, but it added weight to his side of the scale. He made copies and submitted them to the sheriff's office, the building department, and the clerk. If Karen ever claimed his porch was an overreach again, he had documented, dated proof. He didn't confront her with it. He didn't need to. The paper trail would speak for itself. But Karen didn't push harder right away. She changed tactics. For several days, her house was silent. No radio, no presence, no notes. Sean began to think she had stepped back, maybe recalibrating. Then, early one morning before sunrise, he stepped out onto the porch and found the chairs moved. Not all of them, just two, angled differently than he'd left them, slightly askew. At first he thought maybe it was wind or animals, but the camera footage told a different story. At 3:41 a.m., a figure emerged from the edge of his property. Not Karen. The build was wrong, taller, broader. The person wore gloves, moved confidently, without hesitation. They approached the porch, adjusted the chairs by a few inches, and then walked back into the dark. No damage, no theft, just movement, rearrangement. Sean didn't show the footage to the police this time. He sent it to McConnell and asked for it to be formally archived. "She's not trying to intimidate me," he wrote in the accompanying note. "She's trying to unsettle my sense of space." McConnell agreed. "She's trying to make you feel like the house is porous. Like your definition of safe and private is negotiable. That's what's always worked for her. She erodes people slowly." But Sean wasn't eroding. He was sharpening. He upgraded his locks. He added motion-triggered lighting around the porch perimeter. He began backing up his footage to 2 cloud services, and he started logging not just what happened, but what didn't. Days when Karen wasn't visible, nights when no sound came from her house, as if the absence of noise was part of the design too. Then, late one Friday afternoon, something broke the pattern. A county vehicle pulled into his driveway. Sean met the man halfway down the path. He was polite, mid-30s, wearing a department badge on his belt. "We received a report of an illegal porch modification," he explained. "Anonymous complaint. I'm required to inspect." Sean nodded, kept his tone even. "Do you have the original plans?" The man pulled out a folder, unfolded the blueprints. They were dated 1984, and they matched nothing. The porch was missing. The steps were on the opposite side of the house. The house number was right, the lot was right, but the layout was wrong. Sean didn't panic. He didn't argue. He stepped inside, returned with a certified copy of the 2003 renovation permit, and handed it over. The inspector frowned, compared the papers, and nodded. "Looks like it's legit. I'll close it out." When Sean asked if he could keep the 1984 plan, the inspector hesitated. "I'll get you a copy," he said, then left. 2 hours later, the copy was in Sean's inbox. He studied it for a long time, eyes narrowing. The 1984 blueprint had one name on the applicant line: Edward G. Taylor. Sean's father. Long dead. A coincidence? Possibly. But the overlap was enough to send a chill down his spine. He had bought this house for its quiet, for its simplicity, not because of some ancestral connection. He hadn't even noticed the name until now, but Karen had. She had known, somehow. That night, as he reviewed the footage again, he paused on one frame, Karen standing at her gate watching the porch just before sunset. The image was clear, and something about her face looked different. Not angry, not triumphant. Something softer. Not regret, but nostalgia. As if she wasn't watching an enemy. She was watching a scene she had seen before, long ago, and was trying to relive it exactly as it was. Sean felt the weight of that stare. Not violent, but invasive. Not mad, but convinced. He sat back, exhaled slowly, and realized this had never been about ownership in the legal sense. It had always been about preservation. In her mind, that porch had a history she refused to surrender, and now she saw him not as a stranger, but as an imposter, standing where someone else should have been. It began with silence again, the kind that didn't feel restful, but stretched too long and too thin across familiar spaces. For 3 days, Karen didn't emerge from her house. Her porch stayed empty, her curtains closed. Sean checked the footage each night out of habit, but the street remained still, and the audio recordings registered nothing beyond wind and the occasional squirrel skittering along the roof. It should have felt like a reprieve, but instead, Sean felt the way a soldier might when the gunfire stops abruptly. Alert, not relieved. That kind of quiet only came before something larger. On the 4th morning, a delivery truck pulled into his driveway without warning. The man behind the wheel climbed down with a clipboard, walked up to Sean, who had just stepped outside with his mug, and said he needed a signature for materials drop-off. Sean looked at the invoice. It was addressed to his property, but listed under the name Estate Supervisor. No signature, no sender. The shipment included 4 bags of concrete mix, 12 wood panels, and 5 buckets of primer. He refused delivery, of course. The driver shrugged, marked the invoice declined, and left. But Sean stood at the edge of his driveway long after the truck was gone, staring at the spot where the materials had almost been placed. It wasn't just a prank. The order matched exactly what he had used weeks earlier when repairing part of the porch. Someone had mirrored his project down to the quantities. That someone wanted a record to exist of supplies arriving at his house under another name. He called McConnell immediately, and the lawyer instructed him to request a printout of all public complaints associated with his address. When it arrived 2 days later, Sean leafed through a 10-page report. The entry started months ago, anonymous but uniform in tone. Violations of visual code, improper structural renovation, obstruction of historical sightlines, even claims of non-compliance with restoration intent. They read like excerpts from a preservation textbook, filtered through obsession. Sean marked each one, cataloged the dates, and found that nearly all of them aligned with visible moments of tension. Each letter preceded or followed by an incident. The scratch symbol, the petition, the radio static. He had proof now, not just of harassment, but of pattern, escalation, intent. But Karen wasn't done. The next wave came through people. For the first time since he had moved in, neighbors began speaking to him, but not with warmth or curiosity. They asked strange questions in even tones. One man, whose name Sean never caught, stopped him while he was trimming the hedges and said, "Do you know what that porch used to look like?" Sean replied, yes, he had seen the photos. The man nodded slowly. It was meant to be quiet. No one ever sat there like that. Then he walked away. Another woman asked if he had changed the paint color, even though he hadn't touched the trim since move-in. A third simply commented, "It feels different now, doesn't it?" The words weren't confrontational, they were rehearsed, like lines delivered by people who didn't know they were acting. Sean realized Karen wasn't just turning neighbors against him. She was reprogramming the history of the block. She was rebuilding the narrative from the inside out and using community memory as her building material. The porch, in her version of things, had always been quiet, always been untouched, never been used the way Sean used it now, daily, visibly, confidently. And so she began recasting him, not as a threat, but as a disruption. That distinction mattered, because it wasn't about him being dangerous, it was about him being unfitting. In a neighborhood that prized symmetry and history, being unfitting was a far greater sin. Then came the damage. Small things at first. Dirt smeared across his porch light, screws loosened from the mailbox, his garden hose sliced clean at the valve. Not all at once, but over the course of a week. At first he thought they were accidents, perhaps kids cutting through his yard or animals. But then his front steps were painted. Not vandalized, not graffitied. Painted. Just two of them, with an off-white coat that didn't match the rest. The brushstrokes were careful, the application deliberate. When he checked the camera footage, he found nothing. Whoever had done it had timed the act perfectly between motion triggers. Sean stood in front of the mismatched steps and felt something coil inside him, tight and dark. This wasn't chaos. This was ritual, a reclamation performed in acts. Karen was altering the porch slowly, symbolically, not to damage it, but to reclaim it. Sean photographed the steps, filed another report, forwarded everything to McConnell, and finally, against his own instincts, agreed to speak with the town's municipal mediator. The woman, Eleanor, was polite, middle-aged, and clearly used to neighbor conflicts over trees and fences. When Sean explained his situation, laid out the reports, the letters, the video stills, she listened carefully, nodding. Then she said something he didn't expect. "She's done this before. Never quite like this. But she's always found a way to insert herself into certain properties." Sean asked what she meant. Eleanor hesitated. "There's a reason she watches the porch. Her husband died on one. Not this one, but similar. He had a heart attack while repairing the railing. She wasn't home. She didn't find him for hours." Sean sat back. That detail changed everything. Not because it justified her behavior, it didn't. But because it explained her fixation. The porch wasn't just a structure to her, it was a tombstone. Every board, every screw, every inch of visible wood was, in her mind, a tribute to something she had lost and never reconciled. His use of it, his presence upon it, was a desecration of something sacred in her head. That didn't make her less dangerous. It made her more so. Because grief, when unacknowledged, becomes doctrine. It stops negotiating. Sean thanked Eleanor for her time, and as he walked back to his truck, he glanced at Karen's house. She stood in the window just behind the curtain, the fabric pulled slightly to the side. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Sean didn't look away. He nodded. Just once. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. He knew now what she was fighting for, and he knew she would never stop. Not until someone made her. That night, he took his notebook, his hard drive, and every printed document, and walked them over to McConnell's office. "If anything happens," he told the receptionist, "this is the record." Then he went home, sat on the porch in the dark with the lights off, and waited. At 2:11 a.m., motion lights flared briefly near the edge of his driveway. He rose slowly, stepped inside, and checked the feed. A figure stood at the property line, not Karen, her son. He held something in his hand. Couldn't be seen clearly, but he walked slowly, methodically to the edge of the porch, reached down, and placed an object on the top step. Then he turned and left. Sean didn't move until dawn. When the light came, he opened the door and found a box. Wooden, handmade. Inside it, a folded newspaper dated the year his father had passed. The obituary circled in red ink, and beneath it a photograph, faded but unmistakable. His father sitting on a porch that looked nearly identical to Sean's. Karen stood in the background, much younger, smiling. Sean closed the box, locked the door, and finally understood. This wasn't escalation anymore. It was inheritance. And Karen wasn't just trying to push him off the porch. She was trying to erase him from it. The box with his father's photo remained unopened on Sean's kitchen counter for 3 days. He didn't touch it again, didn't unfold the newspaper, didn't look at the circled obituary. It sat there like a piece of evidence from a crime not yet committed, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to name. He knew with a certainty he hadn't been able to explain to anyone that the photograph hadn't been discovered. It had been kept. Preserved. That meant Karen hadn't simply remembered his father's name from some filing cabinet or from town gossip. She had known him. She had watched him. And now she was watching his son in the exact same posture on the exact same porch, 40 years later. The symmetry wasn't just unnerving, it was strategic. She wasn't trying to scare Sean randomly. She was constructing a loop, a living replica of something already lost. And in that reconstruction, Sean wasn't himself anymore. He was a placeholder for someone else. That realization changed everything. What came next didn't feel like escalation anymore. It felt like reenactment. The following evening, the porch lights failed. It wasn't a power outage. Everything inside the house worked. Only the external floodlights, the ones mounted just above the door and under the eaves, remained dark. Sean checked the fuse, the connections, even climbed up with a tester to verify the current. Everything read normal, but the bulbs refused to come on. He replaced them. Still nothing. The cameras worked. The porch was visible, but the light was gone. That night, he sat in the dark again. Only the faint glow of a desk lamp behind the window, giving off any hint of presence. At 3:14 a.m., a knock echoed through the house. 3 firm raps. Not a fist, not a palm. Knuckles. Measured, confident. Sean froze. He didn't rise immediately. Instead, he leaned back slowly, tapped the camera feed on his phone, and waited for it to load. But there was no one on the porch, no one on the steps. He checked every angle. The feed showed nothing, just stillness. He stood, moved to the door, and opened it without stepping outside. The air was cold, still. On the 3rd step, a small object sat upright. A wooden spool, the kind used for holding thread, wrapped tightly in black wire, balanced perfectly, deliberately. He didn't touch it. He backed away, closed the door, and called the sheriff's office. When the deputy arrived an hour later, the spool was gone. No footprints, no drag marks, no indication it had ever been there. But Sean knew it had. He had seen it. And the message was clear. You are not alone out here. Karen's methods weren't confrontational in the traditional sense. They were theatrical, procedural. Everything was staged for maximum psychological effect, not physical damage. She didn't want to hurt Sean. She wanted to convince him. And it was working. Not because he believed her, but because he had started living according to her rhythm. He waited for her next move. He checked the cameras like someone waiting for a broadcast. He flinched at sounds outside the scheduled silence. He was no longer a homeowner. He was a participant. But then she made a mistake. Not a large one. Barely a deviation from her precision. But enough. That Sunday, just before dusk, Sean heard shouting outside. Not a scream, not panic, just raised voices. He stepped onto the porch and saw 2 men arguing near Karen's fence. One was her son. The other, a younger man Sean didn't recognize. They spoke in low tones, but their gestures were heated. At one point, Karen emerged from the house and tried to intervene. Her son pushed her hand away. Sean couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear. Disagreement, frustration. The argument lasted 3 minutes. Then the stranger left, walking quickly down the road. Karen and her son stood in silence. Then he turned and walked back inside without her. She remained on the porch, unmoving, facing Sean. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him, it had changed. There was no smugness now, no calculation. Just something strained and brittle, like glass under pressure. Sean stepped back inside, not because he was afraid, but because he understood. She had lost control of something. Maybe her son had refused to continue. Maybe someone had said no. Whatever it was, her script had cracked. The next morning, Sean received an envelope. No name, no return address. Inside were copies of building permits, old ones dating back to 1982. Each was stamped, each listing small repairs, modifications, paint color changes. All attributed to Edward Taylor, all signed. And on the last page, a hand-scrawled note. He built the porch. But not for what you think. The handwriting wasn't Karen's. Sean stared at the pages for a long time, then locked them in the file drawer without reacting. He didn't know what it meant, but it was meant to shake him. He refused to give it the satisfaction. That evening, a patrol car passed his house slowly, unusual. He hadn't called anyone. But when he stepped outside, the officer rolled down the window. "We received a call about a possible disturbance here," the officer said. "Woman reported yelling, said you threatened her from your porch." Sean blinked. "There was no yelling." "I figured," the officer replied, glancing at the empty street. "We're just checking the box. Nothing to worry about." He left. Sean stood on the porch alone, the sun setting behind him, and understood exactly what was happening. Karen had filed a false complaint, hoping to create a record. Even if dismissed, it would sit in a file somewhere. It was a tactic. One last lever to pull. That night, she crossed the line. At 1:38 a.m., the cameras triggered. Karen, alone, walked up the steps of Sean's porch. Not in disguise, not in the shadows. Brazen, deliberate. She stood in the center of the porch, facing the door. In one hand, she held a small object, too dark to identify clearly. In the other, a folded piece of paper. She bent down, placed the object on the doormat, set the paper beside it, and remained there standing. For 5 full minutes. No movement, no sound. Just watching the door. Sean didn't confront her. He didn't even breathe loudly. He stayed inside, silent, phone in hand, watching the screen. Finally, she turned, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the dark. When the officers arrived, she was still in her yard. Calm. Silent. They arrested her for trespassing, for violating privacy laws, and for intimidation. She didn't resist, didn't protest, just smiled faintly and said, "I wanted to see him one more time." Sean watched from the porch as she was placed in the car, her hands cuffed gently in front of her. She looked back once, not at the house, but at the porch itself. Not angry, not defeated, almost satisfied. When the car disappeared down the road, Sean stepped outside and picked up the object she had left. It was a photograph, old, faded, but intact. It showed a child on the porch, sitting in the same spot Sean always used. Next to the child stood a man. Sean's father. The boy wasn't Sean. It wasn't even someone he recognized, but the handwriting on the back chilled him. Mine, before the noise. The days after Karen's arrest unfolded in a strange quiet, not unlike the one that had blanketed the street in the early days of Sean's arrival. But this time, the silence carried weight. No more radio static in the mornings, no strange objects on the porch, no glances from across the street. The house across from his sat closed, its windows dark, its mailbox unemptied, and its curtains stiff with the kind of stillness that suggested not absence but abandonment. Yet the house itself didn't feel vacant, not entirely. It simply felt like something had ended inside it, like the stage had been cleared, but the light still hadn't been turned off. Sean didn't celebrate. He didn't talk to the neighbors about what had happened, though a few gave him tight nods or awkward greetings that suggested they had heard or seen or simply known enough. The woman who once told him to repaint his trim avoided his gaze entirely. Clara, the one from the next block, left a folded note in his mailbox. It read simply, "I'm glad you stayed." Sean spent the first weekend after the incident taking everything down, every camera, every light, every backup system he had installed, not because he no longer felt threatened, but because he needed to feel like he wasn't bracing for impact anymore. He needed the house to be a home again, not a bunker. When he unscrewed the final floodlight above the porch, he paused, fingers wrapped around the bracket, and looked down at the steps. The scratches were gone, sanded and painted weeks ago, but he could still remember the symbol, still see it in his mind like it had been burned into the wood itself. It no longer filled him with dread. It felt almost pitiful now, the desperate mark of a woman trying to hold on to something that had long slipped away. He finished the removal, tossed the wires into the trash, and stood on the porch with nothing between him and the street but open air. That night, he didn't check the cameras, he didn't check his phone. He sat on the porch with a book and a beer and let the night wrap around him like it had when he first arrived. Before the warnings, before the symbols, before Karen's eyes began following him like a shadow. It didn't feel peaceful, not yet, but it didn't feel hostile either. It just felt real. 3 days later, the sheriff's office called. They informed him that Karen had been released under supervision pending psychiatric evaluation. There would be a hearing, but she was not allowed to return to the property or have any contact with Sean. The officer on the phone kept his voice neutral, but at the end of the conversation he said, "For what it's worth, you did everything right. She's been spiraling for a long time. You didn't cause it. You just weren't willing to pretend it wasn't happening." Sean thanked him, hung up, and went back to sanding the lower porch rail. His hands moved with practiced rhythm, not thinking, not resisting. When the sanding block hit a slight ridge in the wood, his fingers stopped. There, barely visible beneath the new paint, was an old etching, not the sun-shaped symbol from before, something else. Initials, faded, almost illegible. He leaned closer. EGT, his father. The mark had always been there, buried beneath layers of time and finish. Sean didn't know what it meant, whether his father had made it during the build or afterward, or whether Karen had seen it once and shaped her own memory around it. But it was real. That mattered. Later that week, a letter arrived. No return address, postmarked from out of town. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence. "You held your place. That's enough." Sean didn't recognize the handwriting. He didn't try to. He folded the paper, placed it in the same drawer as the photos, and didn't think about it again. Summer arrived without noise. The street settled. Neighbors began waving again. A few invited him to a barbecue. Sean declined, politely, but the offer itself was something new. He spent his evenings on the porch, not because he was watching or waiting, but because it was his. His space, his steps, his seat. He didn't need to prove it. He just needed to keep sitting there. One morning, as the sun crested over the roof lines, Sean brought out his coffee and stood at the edge of the porch. He looked down at the top step, then out across the street to the now empty house. The curtains were still closed, but the silence no longer pressed. It simply lingered. He sat down, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. And for the first time since he moved in, the porch didn't feel like a border. It felt like home.